All right, so this tool was a request of my friend Luai, who is an animator, and he told me that when he is animating, oftentimes he wants to scale the graph editor from the first frame. So let's say we have an animation of a sphere. I'm going to set a few keyframes. And I'll use just one channel for now. And I'm going to move these around like so. All right, so the idea here is that say we want to scale all of this curve. Now, in order to do it manually, we can just press the scale and middle mouse button and drag it up and down. However, the pivot from which it scales is dependent on where we have our mouse cursor. So if we have our mouse cursor here, it will scale based on this point. If our mouse cursor is, say, here, it will scale from this point. But usually we want to scale from a keyframe, and usually from the first keyframe or maybe from the last keyframe. So if we try to do that and we try to position our cursor here and start scaling, so right now it worked pretty well, but oftentimes it's difficult to kind of pinpoint quite that spot, especially if we have a lot of keys, and kind of putting our cursor here and trying to do that doesn't always work. So the idea of this tool would be to have an option to scale exactly from the first selected keyframe. And so depending on which keyframe is selected first, that's the one that will scale the rest of the curve. So as I started thinking about how would I approach writing this tool, I thought of some more things that can be different about it. So one thing is how we scale, which keyframe do we scale the curve from? And the request was to scale from the first one, but I feel like it can also be beneficial to write something that scales from the last one. So since the tool will be scaling it from first, it won't be difficult to add another option to scale from last one. So that's something that I was thinking, oh, okay, this can be like a nice extra feature to switch which frame are we scaling from. Are we scaling from the first one, or are we scaling from the last one? Another thing I was thinking is, how would the animator know which frames are they scaling? If so one way that this tool can work is that, say, they are selecting a frame or even a few frames, and all the keyframes after this frame are getting scaled. So the whole curve is getting scaled. Another way to approach it is to have only a few frames selected and have the tool scale only the selected frames that go after the first frame or before the last one. So that's another option that I thought of. So once I kind of thought it a bit through and thought of all these possible options, I thought, okay, now it's a good time to create a UI. By the way, if I was in a professional environment writing this for an animation team, I would ask an animator who requested the tool, or I would ask the team supervisor about how they want this tool to work. I would ask, wait, so do you want only the first frame, or would you also like an option for scaling from the last frame down? And I would also ask them, okay, would you want it to work only for selection or for the whole curve, or would you like to choose? But in this case, since this is just a tool I'm writing for anyone who'd like to use it, just the recommendation came from a friend, but the friend who recommended it is not my customer. So I can decide on all these different options that I think will be valuable for any animator who will want to use it. Okay, so after I kind of think about that, I start thinking about, okay, how will the UI for this tool look like? And I usually plan the UI on just a piece of paper. But in this case, since I'm doing it on a stream, I will do it in Photoshop. All right, so first I need to remember how to use Photoshop. Okay, well, I do remember the brush tool. Let's see, can I create, I'll try something, the rectangle tool. So I imagine the tool there we go. Okay, I want to increase your width probably and your height. Fill you with empty. So this will be just the border for the UI. There. Okay. I want the border, but I don't want the fill. There we go. Black border of, this is a bit too much, say 5 pixels. Okay, so this is the border for my tool. And the first thing I'm thinking, okay, the main part of the tool will be that scaling part. So how much will the curve be scaled up and down? And that scaling part will probably be just a box where the user will type in numbers. Or maybe we'll have a box where a user can click on the arrows and change the numbers that way. Okay, so to draw that, I'm going to scale this part and put it here. All right, so Photoshop changed how the transform works. So now you have to press Shift to scale it. That's interesting that they did that. Okay, so let's say this is a box where we type in the scale numbers, and I'll just draw 2 arrow buttons. Let me try a different brush. There we go. Okay, so we can have 2 buttons over here that allow us to kind of change the value. Again, that's just one way. That's just one way of doing it. Now, I want options for whether to do it from the beginning or from the end. And the way I thought of showing it is the good way would be through images. So I'm going to now copy there we go. Okay, so I'm thinking that there could be an image on the side, on the left side, and an image on the right side, and that would signify whether we want to duplicate from, oh, sorry, not duplicate, whether we want to scale from the beginning or from the end. Okay. How can I move you? Just move you like this. No, it's the wrong one. Okay. So this will be my button for the beginning of the curve. And this will be one for the end of the curve. And they won't be so much, so they will be buttons, but there will be more of, okay, states, right? So once you press the button, it will always be pressed. Okay. So now the idea here is going to be that this is going to signify, say, the beginning of the curve, or like the first frame, and this will be the last frame. And let's pick some other color to show this will be first curve, and sorry, this will be the first keyframe, and this will be the last keyframe. Okay, and there will be numbers here, something like so. Okay, now I also want an option for whether it's just the selected keyframes or if it's all the curve after the selected keyframe. Okay, so for something like that, I'll want to have a checkbox here, and then we can have a text that, for example, says only, or rather scale selected only. I'd rather type it. Okay. Scale selected only. Okay, so something like so. So this will be the idea, and here I can have an explanation of what scale selected only means. So for instance, there can be text that says, here we can say, alternatively, will scale the whole curve after or before let's change the font for the selected before the first or the last selected keyframe, or the last selected keyframe. Okay, that's a very long text to explain it. Well, alternatively, we can change it for if off. Come on. If off will scale the whole curve after or before the first or the last selected keyframe. Well, that's still a bit too long, but we can write it up in 2 lines, so that will be fine. Okay, so then we need a button that will actually perform the scaling, the button that when we press it, it will scale. That button can go underneath. Let's duplicate this rectangle again. So there can be a button here. That says scale. There we go. So this is kind of the idea of how the tool is going to look like. Again, if I were to present it to a team in a professional environment, I would present something similar. I would show how I'm planning to build it, but I would do something nicer than what I did right here. Okay, and also oftentimes when, when presenting it in a professional environment, you can make slides, or you can also show it on a whiteboard, and then you're in a room with either, if your animation team is small, the animation team or the animation supervisor, and then they can give their input, and they can say, oh, how about we change this, or but this thing I don't quite understand, or this thing we don't quite need. So that can be a back and forth process while you're deciding on the UI and on the functionality of the tool. Okay, so let's say that we agreed on this design. Let's save it so that we remember what we planned later on. So I'm going to save on my computer. Sure, let's save it in the Creative Cloud files. Let's call it Scale Tool Plan. Okay. Yeah, and so this little square is a checkbox, so it can be checked on or off. Now, so when I'm planning how the UI will look like, I also kind of think about the functionality of the tool. So now that I decided on functionality, I'm going to think about how will this actually work. So first, I want to think about what does scaling mean in general. So if I'm going to scale keyframes. What does it mean in terms of numbers? Before I do that though, I would try to scale manually and see if maybe Maya already has some provided functionality for scaling. I don't think it does, but it doesn't hurt to check. Okay, so, oh, actually it does. So it has something called scale key. So whatever you do in Maya in your scene or in any of these windows like the graph editor, Maya gives you an input of a mel command. So mel is a Maya embedded language. So it gives you, so it shows you which command you used. And in this case, it was scale key. So that's really nice because now we can copy this command and we can check documentation for it. I thought we would have to kind of recreate the scaling process, but it looks like we might not have to. So in order to access documentation, you can go right-click and go to Command Documentation. And by default, at least on Windows, it opens in Explorer, even though my default browser is Chrome. I don't know why it does that, but it doesn't matter. We can read in any browser. Okay, so now that I know the command that is used for scaling, I can read about what this command is. And it says this command operates on a key set. Okay, a key set is defined as a group of keys within a specified time range on one or more animation curves. So this is great for us because I wanted a kind of functionality that allows us to scale either selected keys or all of the keys in an animation curve. And it looks like this will allow us to specify the range of keys, so which key we start from and which key we end with. Animation curves comprising a key set depend on the value animation flag. Okay, that's good. So it gives us information about the parameter we can use too. So this is the parameter animation, and it says where this command should get animation to act on. Valid values are objects, keys, and keys are objects. Default keys are objects. So for us, it seems like it will be keys. See description for details. Okay, so it looks like I'll need to look at the examples they have to understand how it works. By the way, so it might be a bit confusing that I first started planning how the UI looked like, and now I'm looking at the scaling functionality. So that's because I usually don't start programming from the UI part. I usually start from the functionality itself. Then I make sure that all the functionality for the tool works. And then I write the UI that will just call the specific functions that do what I need them to do. Okay, so now animation attribute, list of attributes to select, control points, float, value uniquely representing a non-time-based key or key range. I'm not sure what non-time-based here means. Valid float range includes single values or a string with a lower and upper bound. Okay, this is probably what we need in order to set that range of keys that we are scaling. Okay, so now I'm keeping in mind that okay, float is a parameter we'll probably use. Float pivot, scale pivot along the x-axis for float input anim curves. Float scale, amount of scale along the x-axis for float input anim curves. I see. So from what I'm reading, I get that float is a parameter that allows us to specify the range, and float scale is the value that allows us to specify the value that we want to change. And then float pivot is, again, from what I understand and can guess, is the pivot on which we're scaling, which is important for us because that's what we want to change. Instead of having a mouse cursor as a pivot, we want the selected frame to be a pivot. Okay, now hierarchy expansion options, above, below, both, or none. So I think in this case we'll just have no hierarchy. Okay, include upper bound. When time or float flags represent a range of keys, this flag determines whether the keys at the upper bound of the range are included in the key set. Default value true. The flag only valid when argument to the time flag is a time range with a lower and upper bound. Okay, right now I'm not sure I quite understand what this is, but it will probably become apparent once we start using the command. Okay, index of a key on an anim curve, so that will be probably useful when we decide whether we're scaling all the selected curves or whether we're scaling all the rest of the curves. But then it takes an integer, so it takes one index. That's a bit strange to me, so maybe we won't use it after all. We'll just use this command to specify the time. It would be nice to specify the indices, because then we can get it by each frame, but it looks like it takes only one index, not a range. Right. New and float, the end of the float range to which float input targets should be scaled. New and time, the end of the time range to which the target should be scaled. So I guess this determines the end amount by which we scale, and this the end time of which we scale. Okay, new start float, new start time, scale specific keys. Oh, okay, so this is actually what we need. Determines if only the specified keys are affected by the scale. If false, other keys may be adjusted with the scale. The default is true. Okay, but where do we specify the keys? So this specifies the time scale. Interesting. Okay. Shape. Consider attributes of shapes below transform as well, except control points. Default true. Time uniquely representing a key. Okay, time pivot. Scales along the time axis for time input. Okay, I think this is here because we can scale the curve in different directions. So we can scale the curve this way, so on the horizontal axis, and we can also scale it vertically. So I think we more often want to scale vertically than horizontally. So we can just decide that our tool will only work for a vertical scale for now, and later on we can add an option for a horizontal scale too. This is the one thing I didn't think about when kind of working when kind of thinking of how the tool will look like, but this could be another option that we can add, say as a checkbox, like vertical scale, horizontal scale. Okay, but I think for now, as a minimum viable product, we won't have we will only have the vertical scale, and later on we can add an extra one. Okay, this is not what I wanted, this is what I wanted. Okay, time pivot, time scale, amount of scale along the time axis for time input anim curves. Value pivot, scale pivot along the value axis. and then value scale, amount of scale along the value axis. Okay, so I think these are here because we have two axes here, so the y and the x. So the y here is the value and the x is the time. So when they're talking about pivot on time and pivot on value, it's, let's say this key is pivoted on 0, 0 because it has 0 value, and it's, or actually 0, 1. No, 1, 0, because it's 1 on value and 0 on time. Okay, so let's see some examples. Keys and animation curves are identified by either their time values or their indices. Times and indices can be given as range or list of ranges. Time equals, I wonder what this PAL is. I haven't seen this before. What is PAL format? Let's check. Yeah, I'm not sure what that means. Well, let's keep looking. Oh, I see. It maybe I think it determines the frames per second because NTSC means 30 frames per second. Let's see. File format FPS 25 frames per second. No, it's NTSC. Oh yeah, NTSC is 30 frames per second. PAL is 25 frames per second. Okay, so that's what that is. Okay, so time equals all of this means the keys are at time 1 second, frame 15, and time 20 in the currently defined global time unit. Time 1020 means all keys are in range from 10 to 20 inclusive in the current time unit. And I think it's a good idea to use the current time unit because it's up to animator how many frames per second do they want. But we don't really, ideally we wouldn't want to deal with time, but with keyframes rather. Omitting the end of the range means go to infinity, as in the following examples. Time 10 and then just comma means all keys from time 10 in the current time unit onwards. Okay. 010 means all keys up to and including time 10. I wonder what if, yeah, we can't have, no, we can't have keys in minus time. I wonder if this will use them too. Okay, time without any parameters is short form, specify all keys, rather empty. Tuple like this is a short form, specify all keys. Okay, index means the first key of each animation curves. Okay, so it looks like this is what we need. So we need the index here rather than the time. Index 225577 means the third, sixth, and eighth keys. Index 11 means the second, third, fourth, fifth, and sixth key of each animation curve. Scale keyframes from frame 10 to 20. NURB sphere translate X to fill frames 10 to 30. Okay, so they're using scale key, so then they have an object. They have the time 10 to 20, and then they have, oh, I see, so that's where they start scaling from, and that's where they end scaling. And then they're showing the attribute they're scaling where the keyframes are. I wonder if they also accept the name of the animation curve itself. That might be easier for us. Okay, scale all the animation of the active objects. Range 0 to 30 to fill range 0 to 60. Okay, so I see. So here they're specifying the time scale, so say 2, and the time pivot 0. Okay, so we're probably going to be using this parameter, time scale, rather than specifying the new start time and end start time, because that's just easier to think of the time scale in terms of how much we're scaling, rather than what will the end result be. All right, so the one thing I noticed, they're not showing us using the indices. They're showing us how to use the time, but not how to use the specific frames. They have specific frames here, but they're not using them in the command itself, which is interesting because index, yeah, I'm not I just hope that index accepts these values. Okay, now that we have some documentation, let's just try things out. And when I'm trying things out, when I'm figuring out a new command, I usually just work in the script editor itself. When I'm actually writing code, I'm starting to write code, I use an external editor for it. All right. So first thing I'm going to do, so first let's see what are the flags that they're using here. And of course they're using short names for flags, so we always need to check and convert them. So they're not including the upper bound. What is TS? I guess time scale. Yes, time scale, and then value pivot is 0. Okay, so they're setting value pivot. They're setting time pivot. So time pivot, let's make a note that time pivot in our case is going to be the time of keyframe, and value pivot is going to be value of keyframe. Let's do it for first keyframe of first keyframe. Okay, so this is good, and then they have VS value scale probably. Yes, amount of scale along the value axis. So that's the one we need since we're only doing the scale vertically. We can say value scale amount to scale on for amount to scale. That sounds good. That's value scale. What else are they using? Value, okay, value pivot, time pivot, scale, and in brackets we can add for horizontal scale, can add time scale, because time is horizontal, value is vertical. Okay, now that we know all of that, let's try just using this command with hard-coded values to see how it will work. So the command is called scale key. So the first thing I'm going to do is to import my commands as MC, because I'm using Python, so I need to import all the mel commands. And the next thing, I'm going to use this command scale key. Scale key. Oh wait, so in this case, let's scale this specific curve, and our time pivot is going to be 1. Our value pivot is going to be 0. And let's scale it by the amount of 2, for instance. So our value scale is going to be 2. Let's first check that this works. Okay, so that's worked, and by default it works for a selected curve. So if we don't have anything selected, it will probably give us an error. Let's see. No, I guess it does it for the last selected curve then. Or for selected object. I guess it scales everything on the selected object then. In this case, it should give an error. Okay, good. It does. Now, let's make it work for our specific object. Again, we can hard code it for now. So in this case, we have, what is this curve? Translation. Let's do it for one curve. So I'll remove all of these curves. I'll just have translate, I'll just have it on translate X. Okay. All right, so there was an attribute parameter, and there was an object that we can specify. So our attribute is going to be translate X, and the object is going to be pSphere1. Okay, so now I'm going to check if this still works. Okay, looks like it does. And let's see if it works if I don't have anything selected. Okay, so in this case it didn't error. And hopefully it did do the scaling. Let's see. So this value here, let's make it something more specific. Say 0.5. Oh, you guys. There we go. So it's 0.5. So if the scale happens correctly, it should be at 1. No, okay, so this didn't work quite as expected. Let's see. Okay, so it works now. Oh wait, it's translate X. So I think it did work. Okay, let's see. So it's at 1 now. Let's unselect it. So it should be at 2 when we select it back. Yes, okay, now it's at 2. Okay, great. So this works. And that's great. I want to make the font large enough for everyone on the stream to see, but I also want to be able to see the whole line. Okay, I'll just have to move, or there we go. Okay, but now I'm thinking that it would be better if we could operate with an animation curve itself, because when we're checking the selection, the attribute itself might not be selected, so we might not be able to retrieve the selection of the attribute, but we can retrieve the selection of the animation curve. So if this animation curve is selected, and we use a command to get the selection, and that's lssl equals true. So it gives us an object that's selected. So there is a command that allows us to see the selected animation curve. But I can't remember what it is. Let's go to Chrome. Let's see, Maya, Python. Selected animation curve. No, find keyframe command. Yeah, so I think we can do it through the keyframe command. So this command helps us to query which animation curve is the key that we selected on, or which animation curve, hopefully also which animation curve we have selected. So since we have keyframes selected, we can get which animation curve we are on from those keys, and we can also get which keys are selected from that command. I also wonder, so we have the select key command here, so we can look at that too. Because maybe this command also provides us with information about which keyframe is currently selected. Oh no, it's not queryable. Okay, so this command won't give us the answer. So you can see it can only create it. We can't query from it anything. But we can query things from the keyframe command. Let's open up, well, we already have documentation there, but let's open it in the same browser. So if we are to get this keyframe command, it has a lot of useful options, including finding the key and the curve we're on. So the reason why I'm saying that is because I want to check if this will work if we pass a name of the animation curve instead of just the name of the object and the attribute. So to find this animation curve, we can just select it and see it here. So it's psphere1 translate x. It's usually the name of the object, then underscore, and the name of the attribute. Okay, so I'm going to place it here instead and see if this works. Okay, nice, it does. So it does accept animation curve as an input, which is great for us because we can figure out which animation curve we're on from this keyframe command. From the same command, we can figure out which keyframe do we have selected. Keyframe or keyframes. Okay, so the first command we're using is the scale key command, so it's the first useful command we found. The next useful command we found is the keyframe command. So we can look at it as well. So again, it has a lot of excuse me. It's a lot of parameters that we can look at, including this selected. When used in queries, the select returns requested values for any active keys. So immediately I'm thinking, okay, this can be useful to us. Time change and value change can be also useful to find. So it shows us it can show us time change and the value change for the whole curve, for all of the rest of the keys. So that can be useful if we're changing all of the keys. Okay, and here are some examples of them specifying time and time change. And here are examples of querying. So we can query last selected. For the above script, the last selected key is the keyframe 14. The following may be used to query the value for that key. So they're specifying the last selected, they're checking the name, I guess the name of the animation curve, like so. Then they're querying what time is the last frame at, last selected one, and which value it's at. So the fact that they have last selected, I would assume they also have first selected. See, there's last selected here. Oh, but they don't have first selected. That's interesting. I would assume that if they have last one, they would have first one as well. Yeah, looks like they don't. But that's fine. That's fine for us, because if we have all of the selected, hopefully we get through this command, we can get what the first selected one is. Requested values for any active keys. Okay, well, let's check that. So the two things we need to find is name of the anim curve, and we also want to find the time of the first selected keyframe. Okay, so to get the time of the first selected keyframes, let's try this selected command, unless there is anything else in the examples that can help us. Let's see, so this can find nodes. How many keys are selected on NURBS cone 1? Okay, so what is KC? Let's see, keyframe count. Okay, so it's the amount of keys selected. So in our case, so we want to find, so first we will find all of the selected keyframes, and then we'll find the first one. So we want to find both their times and their values, because we need a value pivot and the time pivot here. So we can use the keyframe command. And so first, to find the name of the atom curve, let's try that name. The name parameter, let's see what this gives. Gives us, if I select these keyframes. Okay, so that's good. So this gives us the name of the animation curve. Okay, and then later we'll need to check how it works for multiple curves. But for now, we just want to make it work for one curve and for one very specific example, and then kind of broaden up and make sure that it works for multiple other cases. Okay, so wait, time and value of the first selected curve. Okay, so to find the first selected curve, we want to find all of them. So again, we can use this keyframe command, and we want to query, and we want to check the time change, and then we can check the value change. So if we're to check the time change, it shows us 12 and 31, and that's correct. So these are the times of these keyframes. So this one is 12, this one is 31. So we know that that's correct. I wonder though, we should probably specify that we're dealing with selected ones. Though I think it does that by default. Let's see, okay, good. So 12 and 31. And let's also specify here that we're dealing with the selected one. Okay, and atom curve in this case, let's check what atom curve is. And it's p sphere 1 translate x. So that's correct. Okay, so we found the time change and the value change. So what we get here is, so again, we can check the value changes, and it's 2 and then 1.2, and we can check this one is 2 and this keyframe is 1.2. So now these are selected frame times, and these are selected frame values. So now that we have, an animation curve, we have the times, and we have the values. And those are all the components that are needed here. So here we need the name of our animation curve, we need the time, and we need the value. So to get the first time from here and to get the first value from here, since these are just a list, the first one will be index 0 of this list. And to make it clear, we can even add variables for it here. So we can say first frame is selected frame times 0, or we can pass it along here. So we can say selected frames time. We can say it's 0 here, and then value pivot is going to be index 0 of the values. Okay, so now we can try running our code and seeing what if it does what we want it to do. Okay, so right now it did scale the frames, but it scaled all of them. So it scaled from both before and after. But what we want is we want to scale everything after the first selected frame. So to change that, and so if we, for example, pick the first one, this will work nicely. So it scales everything after this first one. But if, did I do anything important here? No, I don't think so. Okay, but if we pick, say, this one as the first one, then it will scale everything here as well. But what we probably want is to scale everything after this selected frame. That, by the way, is another thing we can add as an option for an animator, to either scale everything or just to scale everything after or everything before. So maybe now working with it, I'm thinking maybe that UI needs a bit of a revision. So maybe we want to give an extra option to kind of scale everything. All right, but for now, let's just make it scale everything after the selected frame. Okay, so now what we can do is create a function out of this, because it's the function, because with a function we can add parameters and we can later connect the function to a UI. So I'm going to create a function called scale frames. And now at this point, if you remember, we had an idea of whether we want to scale starting from the first one or from the last one. So since we have that, we can add a parameter here for whether we're dealing with the first frame or the last one. So we can call the parameter is first. And if it's true, it will scale from the first one. If it's false, it will scale from the last one. So if is first, we can make time pivot be equal to this selected frame times, and value pivot be equal to selected frame values 0. And if it's not first, then it will be last. So we can again get the last one of the value pivot, of the time pivot, and the last one of the times, and the last one of the values. And then we can use these variables here. Okay, so now this is getting kind of lengthy. So I'm going to move all of this to work with the code from an editor. And I'm here in the scripts directory. So it's in documents, Maya, then Maya version scripts. And by default, Maya will import scripts from this directory, which is why I'm going to create a new Python script called scale frames, or scale keyframes, or scale selected. I think scale frames is fine. Okay, so now I can get this code and paste it here. And I'm going to remove all of this since we don't need it anymore. To make this window a bit larger. And over here in the script editor, I'm just going to import this scale frames, this scale frames module. Okay, so I'm going to import it first, and I'm going to reload it since I'm going to be changing it. And then I want to call this function. But since the file itself is called scale frames, I'm going to call the function main instead. Okay, and is first is true by default, so I don't need to specify it here. All right, so let's check that this works fine. Okay, looks like it works the same way as it did before. So let's see. So right now we're getting this anim curve, but we're not passing it along. So let's do that. And let's test this again. Okay, nothing changed. So now let's think of how we can use the time range in order to specify that we want to scale only from the first keyframe. Well, we can use this scale keys parameter for it. It had, if you remember, it had like the start time, and we know the start time or the end time from this time pivot. So let's look at the keyframe command again, and let's look for, no, what was it? The something time, clip time maybe, or time change. Yeah, I think it's just time in this. Oh, sorry, it's not a keyframe command. We want scale. What is it called? Scale key. Okay, so we have our scale key here. And now, okay, so it has a value scale time scale. So I think, oh, that time range. So this is what we need. And let's look at the examples. So yeah, and here it shows how we can specify time. So in this case, our time will be equal to, so the start point will be our time pivot, and the endpoints will depend on what we want to do, whether we want to scale everything after the selected keyframe, or if we want to scale just the selected ones. So let's default to everything after selected keyframe. Oops. Okay. So let's see if this works. This doesn't seem to scale anything at all. Why not? What if we select two of them? Okay, so is first, time pivot is in the beginning. Let's see, maybe I'm not using it correctly. Means all keys, oh, right, because this is time in seconds. So we probably need index instead. At least I hope. Let's try that. No, index would be, say, 1, because this is keyframe number 1. Well, let's actually try just hard coding it as 1. Let's try now. No, still nothing. Let's check again that this works. Okay, this does work. Well, let's see, what are we doing wrong? Well, let's try. So we tried hard-coded values for index. Let's try hard-coded values for time. Let's say we want from frame 12 to frame 44. This won't be in frames, so this, I think by default it's in seconds. So let's see. Time-based and curved by 10 ranges. Okay. Again, it's a keyframe command, not a. Yeah, let's close this. This is what I want. The scale key command. Okay, so here they're using time. Okay, so fill frames 10 to 30. Okay, so this is frames. Keyframes from frame 10 to 20. Okay, so this will be frames. But why aren't they working out? And here they're using time and then time scale and time pivot. This won't change anything, but let's change the position of it. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, so this worked. Right, something changed. Yeah, okay. So this is good. So it changed as if we were to scale this part. So this part. Okay, so that's nice. Okay, so at this point, we are working on, we're using it as if we're scaling everything after the first selected keyframe. So if we want to make it work until the end, we should be able to change this. Oh yeah, so let's try actually, so we hard-coded 44, so let's now just try 12. Okay, so this didn't work. And this did. Okay, so that's the difference. Which doesn't make sense because here in their documentation, they're saying that it should work. 10 and then comma means all keys from time 10 onwards. So this should work fine. But it doesn't. Oh, what if we put it like so? I don't think this will work. But let's see. Yeah, gives us a type error. Okay, well, no matter. We can still use the first frame, our time pivot, and we can use our last frame like so. So this should work on selection. Let's try this. Okay, nice. So this works. Then let's now see if it works correctly. So right now it should scale only these two selected. Let's try that. Okay, that works. But we still want to have it scale kind of for the rest of the curve. Like we want to give an option to an animator whether they want to select the whole curve or whether they want to scale only the selected ones. So for selected ones, this is what we're going to, so we're going to do something like this. So let's duplicate this line and let's comment out this one. Okay. Now, let's find how we can do it for the rest of the frames. So if nothing works with this command, what we can do is we can find what the last frame of the curve is, and just do it that way. But it would be nice to do it through the scale key command if it offers us such an option. So let's see. So it has new start time. I wonder if it has. So the fact that it has time means that this time is kind of the old time. But I feel like if they have new start time, new end time, maybe they have just start time, end time. No, it doesn't look like it. Control points. This flag explicitly specifies whether or not to include control points of shape. Okay, that's not what we want. Value, we also don't care about right now. Float scale. Yeah, I don't see. Yeah, I don't see anything that can help us here, and I think that this parameter is not working as advertised. All keys from time 10 onwards, but when we try to do that, this doesn't work. So let's try that. Yep, doesn't work. And this does work. Okay. So another thing we can do to make it work for the rest of the curve is, as I mentioned before, so we can get what the last frame of this animation curve is. So we were checking what is the last selected frame, but we can also check what is the last frame overall. So let's check for all frame times. Though I feel like when the last time we tried it, it didn't quite work. But let's see. So if we have this command, see keyframe, and we want to check all time changes. So let's specify our animation curve. It's going to be sphere 1 translate X. Okay, let's see if this works. So let's say if nothing is selected. Okay, so this is good. And if we have these selected, will it still work fine? Yes, okay, so that works. So we can use the keyframe with almost the same parameters apart from selected. And we want to pass our animation curve along. And I wonder if it's a good idea to pass it here too, just in case. But since we're doing it for selected, it doesn't really matter. Okay, all frame times. Let's just call it all times. We could call it all time changes, but all times is fine. And so if we want to do it for until the last frame, we can pass along all times and do it this way. Okay, so let's test it. We don't need this anymore. We do want to run this part. Okay, so that worked. So it scaled everything from the first selected frame until the end. So that should also work if we just select one frame and everything here will be scaled down. Okay, so that's really cool. So now we have several parameters that we can deal with. We can deal with which frame is first and last and change that here. And we can change whether we're scaling only the selected frames or all frames after the first one. So instead of doing this, we can say what the first and the last frames are, because we will need to use them later on anyway. So let's call it first frame first value. This might be a bit of an overshoot, so if this ends up being like too much, we can remove this these lines. Last frame, or what was, yeah, and then no, last selected frame last frame. Now this will be too much. Better yet, just specify them here, I'd say, and just do a bunch of if statements for whether we're dealing first with last and whether we're dealing with the whole what's it called, with the whole time range or not. So let's have another parameter called selected frames, or maybe are selected frames, to make sure that we understand it's a Boolean. Are selected frames, and by default let's make it true, because that's how Maya works by default. So by default, when we select frames in Maya and start scaling them, it works on specifically selected frames, not on all frames that follow. So that's why I'm setting this to true by default. Okay, so now now, so for right now, I'll just do it in kind of a lengthy way, and it might be a bit too many lines here. So later on, we can look at how we can simplify it. Okay. So first off, this time pivot. So this time pivot is either the first or the last of the selected frame times. So we can say if is first, and sorry, we don't need brackets here, thinking in a different language. Okay, and also this is not taking up too much in this line, so I'm going to separate it into two. Okay, so this time will be here selected frame times the first one, and then from the first one until so here we would want, again, this will be a lot of if statements. We can clear it up later. So if is first and our selected frames, then we want from the first selected frame until the last selected frame. Then else if is first and not selected frames, then oh yeah, and this will be again the first selected value and the last selected value. Okay, so here we are going to, so if they are not selected frames, then we want to do it until the end of the timeline. And for that, we will use all times. So this will be until the end of the timeline. And oh yeah, and we want all values too, because we want to specify, oh, actually, no, we might not need. Yeah, because we need a value for the pivot, but we don't really need the value for specifying the range. Okay, so now so not select frames, then else if not is first, and our selected frames. So in this case, we can again scale the key, and we'll be scaling from the end. So we'll be using selected frame times -1 and until the first one. So selected ones and then the first one. And then the time pivot will be the last frame, the last selected one, and the value pivot will be selected frames -1. So here it will actually be 0. Right? Right, like so. Okay, so now the very last option is if we have, if it's not first and they're not selected, so in that case, we can have our, so it will be not selected, so it will be, so for time, it will be from the first frame in the time curve and until the selected one. So we still want selected frame times -1. Okay, so now the time pivots will be from the selected one, so these will be the same. Okay, and so now we don't need this line anymore, and we're going to check how this whole thing works. Okay, so let's select these frames and run our code. Okay, so this works based on the first selected and the selected frames being equal to true. Okay, and this works as well, so that's great. Now let's change this. So now let's check if it will work for is first is false, so that will mean we're scaling from the last frame, and our selected frames is also going to be false. Well, actually, let's make our selected frames true. Okay, great. So it scales up by 2, and it only works for these 2 selected frames. That's great, and it scales from this pivot. And now let's change this to false. And so now all of these should scale. Let's see if that happens. Yes, okay. So this is great. It means it's working as planned. So now, so there are 2 things left to do. So first we want to check if we are, how will it work if we have multiple animation curves selected? And then another thing we want to check for is, or not check, but rather change, is all of this code, because it's kind of a lot. So it's a good idea to think about how we can make all of this a bit shorter and remove redundancy. So one thing we can do is in the beginning here decide what our time is going to be, as well as our time pivot and value pivot based on these if statements, and have only one scale key over here. So that will make it a bit more readable from the get-go. Okay, so in this case, our time start is going to be this selected frame 0. Our time end is going to be selected frames -1, and then our time pivot is going to be selected frame values 0, and value pivot is going to be this. Okay, oh yeah, another thing, so the scale value we can also, is also a parameter, right? Because that will be changing in the UI. Let's call it scale amount. And by default, let's make it 1. So by default, it won't scale at all. And let's remove these here. Okay, so now this is the case of the first option. So now let's just keep changing these here as well. And again, later on, and in a bit, I think we'll find a way to make it even shorter than this. Okay, so in this case, this time end will be all times. These two will be the same. So we can now remove this, and here, instead of these values, we can put time start, time end, so we'll just use the variables that we just created. This will be time pivot and value pivot. So this is already looking more readable instead of having the same command repeated 4 times. Okay, so now so now this third option. So again, I just copy the things I had here from the last to the first, and it will pivot from the last one. Okay. Okay. There we go. Is that good? Yes. All right, so this is already a bit better. So we have one command here, and these if statements are just changing these values. But again, we can simplify this further because so these are specific to whether it's the first frame or if it's the last frame. And these last two are specific to whether the frames are selected or not. So whether the frames are selected or not is going to, or rather, the selected or not selected frames, the range of them will change depending on whether it's first or last. Because for the first select, we want everything from the first until last, and the other way, we want them the other way around. So I think one way to make it look nicer, let's see if it does end up looking nicer. So we can say if is first, then we can do this because this is the same in both of these cases. So actually, no, sorry, these two. So the pivot will be the same. But so, and the time start will actually also be the same. And then the time end will change. So let's make time end selected by default, and then we can say if not our selected frames, our time end is going to be all times, like so. Okay, so this is already simplifying all of this. And then in the case where it's not time first, and that's also, we'll comment these ones in a bit. Okay, in case it's not, then okay, so time pivot, value pivot, time start. Okay, so it's everything apart from time end. So let's put this in the end too. And so if time end is different, right, does everything else look the same? No, times, oh, so here time start is different. So time end is going to be the same here. No, time end is different here too. So what about here? Let's see. So time start is the same. Time end is different. But then the time pivot is the same. So why is time pivot? Okay, time pivot is the same here. That's correct. Time start should be the same here as well. I think I made a mistake here. So in case it's the last one selected, time start should still be the last selected one. Oh, I wonder actually, when we specifying scale, does it scale backwards? So that's something we can check. So what I'm trying to see is whether time end can be before time start, or whether it always should be after. So let's see. I think time start should always be before time end, so that because it's the pivot that specifies what we're scaling. But let's see. So let's use this scale key command. Let's use our curve and let's specify. So we have time pivot and value pivot. So let's copy all of these in. Okay, so time in this case is going to be, okay, so let's try, so first let's try doing them backwards. So let's try 31 and 12, and the pivot will be 31, and what is the value here? 1.233. Let's make it just 1, so that's easier to write. Okay, so value pivot is going to be 1, and then now let's try scaling these. Oh, invalid syntax, where? There we go. This will be 2. Okay, so it did scale from this point and it scaled up. So what if we put 12 first and then 31? Okay, the same. So it doesn't really matter. So it can be the first one or the last one. So in that case, let's start with the correct one. Let's start with the last selected frame. I'll change this here. And let's end with the first of all times. Okay. So in this case, again, it's the time end that's going to be different. And in case we are dealing with selection, the time end is going to be the last, or rather the first of the selected frames. And if it's not selected, if we're not dealing with selected frames, it will be just the end of all of the times we have. Okay, so now we can remove all of this code. Okay, so now it's much nicer and cleaner. We can probably make it shorter somewhere else. So we can, for instance, say if not is first here and not do anything here. But that will be a bit long performance-wise because, oh, and let's, instead of else, let's put if not selected frames. But this will be a bit longer performance-wise because if it's not, if we are doing it from the last frame, then it will first run this code and it will run this code again. So in this case, forking can be a good thing. Okay, so let's say if is first, we'll run this chunk of code. And otherwise, we'll run this code. Okay, so this looks like it for kind of the main functionality. Let's see, let's look at our UI plan again. So we wanted to have a choice whether we change either selected only or all of them. We want to choose whether we're changing it from the first frame or the last frame. We want to specify the amount, and we want to be able to scale. So everything that we planned our UI to do, we'll be able to do by changing these parameters. Okay, so I think I'll say that that's it for today. I'll come back to this probably next week. Tomorrow I'll stream myself playing some games, but then next week I want to do another kind of live coding session, and during that time I will do a UI for this tool. Okay, and for now, thank you for watching.